Thank you so much for having us here this evening. As Lindsay said, we're going to be introducing the fieldwork that has been undertaken at Smallhythe over the last couple of years. We have a lot of slides, so we're going to rapidly whip through lots and lots of beautiful images of a National Trust place. Smallhythe in Kent is possibly best known as the home of Victorian actress Ellen Terry, who moved into the property in the closing years of the 19th century and passed away there in 1928. And the property presentation there is to Ellen Terry. So it's set up as a museum in memory of her by her daughter, Edie Craig. We could say the second most famous thing about Smallhythe, but maybe for this audience, the most famous thing is the knowledge that Smallhythe was once a centre of medieval royal shipbuilding. So we're going to be talking to you about that tonight, and also some bonus Romans. So just to set us in context, this is Smallhythe viewed from the air. So in the centre here we have Smallhythe Place and the barn behind it. The National Trust owns this garden here. This is the chapel rather, of St John the Baptist. This is what's called the Elfwick Field. This is also within the National Trust ownership. And then behind we have the Forestall Field, and that is the extent of our holding in Smallhythe. We are looking essentially downriver, downstream. So this running through here is the Reading Sewer, which is the remnants of what was once the mighty River Rother, or the Lyman, as it was known further back in time. So heading out to sea that way. And on the right-hand side of the screen is the Isle of Oxney. So we've been doing, as part of our project, some documentary research with Celeste van Gent from the University of Oxford. Smallhythe now is a very small place, and that is usually what's described as the derivation of the place name, is that it is a small hithe, or a small landing place. What we've discovered through Celeste's work is that actually, potentially, the derivation of a small hithe may well come from a person rather than a place. So slightly earlier than the earliest documented references we had previously, we have these mid-13th century references held in the cathedral archives at Canterbury, which refer to land grants between family members. And one of the sort of defining landscape features is that this land lies nearby to the land of Robert the Small. So Smallhythe may be in reference to a small chap rather than it being a small place. And actually there's a series of two grants between these family members, and then there is an earlier one as well, which references William the Small, who we think is Robert the Small's father. So they are a congenitally small family. So possibly the Smallhythe is actually the Hythe of the Smalls, rather than it always being this tiny place. So that was a rather nice discovery out of the documentary research. We're also really lucky in that we have quite a rich resource of historic mapping for this area. So this is a 1594 plan by Simonson, and we're just zoomed in onto the detail here so we can see Smallhythe, which is circled in the centre there. So you can just get a view of the landscape in the late 16th century. This is a really dynamic landscape, this area around the Rother levels, leading out onto the Romney Marsh, and it's at the kind of gateway between the marshland and the higher ground of the Weald. So we have Smallhythe here lying on the north side of this northern branch of the Rother, and then the southern branch wraps round the bottom part of the Isle of Oxney there. And at this stage you can see sort of land reclamation actually underway on that southern side. Moving through time, we obviously have 18th century drawings as well. So this is the 1740s Bowen plan of Kent. We can see Smallhythe just here. And then the Sussex version in the 1760s. Again, Smallhythe here with this main watercourse still running here, but also now running to the south. And Eliott's going to be talking a little bit more about the course of the river over time. By the early 19th century, so this is the first edition OS, you can see the sort of more dispersed shape of the village that we know now is now quite clear on the mapping there. And also quite nice to see all the landforms, so you can actually see those areas of higher ground still protruding. A lot of really important work, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, was undertaken by the Romney Marsh Research Trust over decades of research on the marshland area. So we have a good understanding of that process of land reclamation across the Romney Marsh, across the Walland Marsh, and how that would have affected the river, the tidal flow up into the area that we are studying. So Smallhythe, again, just in this area here. But what it really brings home is how that change through the medieval period, particularly with all of these sort of periods of land reclamation, affects our view of Smallhythe now. So Smallhythe now does not feel like a coastal site, but in the Roman period, in the earlier parts of the medieval period, it would have been very much closer to the sea. And now, of course, we also have fantastic resources like LiDAR data, which can help us look at landform, and really useful stuff from the Environment Agency looking at surface water and potential flood impacts, should sea levels continue to rise. So you can get a really clear view of sort of what earlier iterations of the Smallhythe landscape might look like, and potentially what they could look like in the future. That's a slightly alarming one, so we're going to pass on from that. Just to go back briefly to that one. Oh, I can't go back, so we won't. No, I can. Hang on. So just to put us in context again, Smallhythe is basically there, Smallhythe Place. So it potentially, in the future, is a site at risk. Well, it's not just potentially. It is a site at risk from climate change should, seawalls breach and things like that. I've broken it now. Okay. In terms of sort of direct archaeological investigation, however, we have much less data because this is an area that isn't heavily developed. We don't have a lot of developer-led archaeological projects in this area. So there has not been a huge amount of excavation in the sort of environs of Smallhythe previously. We do have some antiquarian records. So, for example, we have this vessel, which was discovered in 1822 and reported on in the pages of Archaeology, excavated from Maytham Wharf, which is just a couple of miles upstream of Smallhythe. It appears to be a vessel that was actually wrecked with its cargo and individuals on board as well. It was, as you can see from the image, fully excavated, lifted, and apparently exhibited in London, but where, I'm not sure, and where it has ended up, I don't know. We'd like to find one of these. So it's not really until the 1990s that we have sort of modern excavation at Smallhythe, and that is when the mighty time team rolled into town for a 3-day evaluation to look for evidence of medieval shipbuilding in Smallhythe. Has everyone watched the Smallhythe time team programme? I do recommend it to you. Some of you in the audience are actually in it. I could embarrass them by pointing it out, but I won't. But it's a really interesting programme, and definitely when you watch the programme and read the report that was written by Gustav Milne and Peter Bellamy afterwards, you get the impression that they ran out of time and there was a lot more that they could have done, and there were things that were being found at the end that would have been really good to investigate further. So this is the area where the time team work intersected with the National Trust property. So they did work partly on our site and partly in the fields around. They dug a couple of trenches in the Elfwick field looking for this evidence of medieval shipbuilding, and a couple of trenches in the Forstall field to the east of Smallhythe Place. They were not allowed to dig in the garden at Smallhythe Place, and it is one of the best bits of the time team filming, with this really, really fierce National Trust custodian and time team, so Tony Robinson bounces up and says, "Can we dig in your garden?" And she just goes, "No." Get off my land. We can dig over there. That's okay. So what did they find? I've completely broken that somehow. So, again, Eliott will sort of discuss this in more detail, but they found the remnants of part of a brick kiln. They found a lot of evidence for medieval shipbuilding in the form of nails and roves. So roves are the diamond-shaped washers that are very distinctive, used in medieval ships. And they also did find fragments of nautical timbers. So the bottom one of the slides there is the piece that is now on display in Tenterden Museum. And it is, at the moment, the only extant piece of medieval ship's timber that has been recovered from the site. So spoiler alert, we have not found a piece of medieval ship yet. We'll just get that out now because we're a bit sad about that. But there's all to play for. So this is from Gustav and Peter's publication, again, just setting Smallhythe in context with the surrounding locale. So through the 2000s, the National Trust commissioned a whole range of other pieces of work at the property. So vernacular building surveys of all the structures that we have on the site undertaken by Archaeology South East, a historic landscape survey, again by Archaeology South East, which helped us to sort of map out the features that we could see in the landscape and try and start to phase them. And a piece of work in 2006 to install, we do all the glamorous projects at the National Trust. This one was for a water treatment plant and involved digging a slice across the Forstall field, which gives us a very, very useful section right through that eastern part and intersected with the Time Team Trench as well. So of particular note during this excavation was a series of sort of chalk blocks that were found in this area, which they interpreted as possibly part of a road or a routeway or part of a yard surface, and also Roman material for the first time from this site found in the Forstall field in 2006. Some building material, about 2 kilograms of building material and a small assemblage of Roman pottery, including imported wares. Through the remainder of the 2000s, smaller pieces of work. This is actually the remnants of a well in the gardens. It was hiding under a rockery, and when the gardeners removed the rockery, they found this, which is clearly why the rockery was there in the first place, and that has now been covered back up again. And episodes where the sediments have been cleared from the pond at the front of the property on the southern side of the property. So this is what the pond looked like during Ellen Terry's occupation. All of this brick and masonry appears to have been removed. So there were no artefacts discovered during the most recent period of dredging, which was in 2017. And of course, we do have a collection of material at the property, which has been unearthed over the course of decades during gardening. So we have this reference to an ancient tear bottle, said to be Roman, given to the British Museum. It's another artifact we haven't been able to track down yet. It probably looks something like this, so potentially not Roman, might have been more of a sort of post-medieval little medicine bottle or something like that. And as I said, artifacts that have been found in the locale. So we've got some Nuremberg trading tokens, some jetons. We've got a cut penny of Edward VI, a thimble, fragments of medieval ceramic, hop tokens, things like that. So things that are certainly giving us that picture of a bit more of a picture of daily life at Smallhythe through the medieval and early post-medieval periods. 2018, we commissioned a graffiti survey of all the buildings to further understand those structures and complement the vernacular building surveys. That was undertaken by Matthew Champion. And in 2019, the Hastings Area Archaeological Research Group did some geophysics for us, so mostly magnetometry, and essentially extended the area that Time Team had covered. So in the Time Team sort of period, they weren't able to geophys the whole field. And there is, again, some scenes where the geophysicists are very excited, pointing out all the signals that they were getting in Elfwick Field and saying, we must do more, and then they weren't able to finish that. And Haag's work really gave us a great picture of a very busy, active scene in the Elfwick Field. So there are no standing structures in this part of the field whatsoever. but there is clearly a considerable amount of buried archaeology, largely undisturbed. So this is the kiln that time team excavated in the 1990s. None of this signals had been explored at all previously. It should also be noted that while they were doing the geophysical survey, Haag also recorded an assemblage of Roman material as surface finds from this field. So we were really excited to be planning a project to investigate the buried archaeology at Smallhythe and follow up on these really key pieces of work. So we set up a project funded by the National Trust's Inclusive Archaeology Fund and also from the Royal Archaeological Institute yourselves. Thank you very kindly for the funding. And the idea was to make it a community research project with lots of opportunities for people to engage directly with the archaeology on site and also to come and visit. This was all planned for 2020 and obviously didn't quite work out like that. But we have been on site in August 2021 and 2022. So we've completed 5 weeks of excavation over those 2 years. And those sort of key research aims are here. So a better understanding of the Roman activity and its extent, more investigation of the medieval village of Smallhythe, understanding more about this shipbuilding activity on site, and can we find any evidence for the proposed 1514-15 Great Fire of Smallhythe, which apparently burnt the village to a cinder. I'm going to probably give another spoiler about that in a minute. So there we were, 2021, all ready to rock and roll. Contemplation in fields, yes. Looking for medieval ships, yes. Possibility of some truly horrendous weather, yes. Tick, tick, tick. So off we went. Not that we were influenced by a certain film that came out in the early part of 2021. So here's our site plan for 2021, and I should add as well that we only finished fieldwork at the very end of August 2022, so some of the things you're about to hear are subject to change, potentially in the light of future interpretation. So in year one, we dug 7 trenches across the Elfwick field, 1 in the garden, and 2 in the Forstall field, and a series of boreholes. It was extremely wet in 2021, so we did have some truly horrendous weather, it has to be said, which was in direct contrast to 2022, when we worked through the heat wave, and it was extremely dry. And we dug a further 9 trenches and reopened trench 1 at the top. So this is our initial sort of site plan as we've come back off-site this summer. The small dots that you can see at either side are the locations of metal-detected finds, which Eliott's going to be talking through in a moment. So I'm just going to start from the latest archaeology we discovered and move backwards, hand over to Eliott for medieval shipbuilding, and then I'm going to jump back in at the end for Romans. So the northernmost of our trenches is trench 16, which was right up next to, as close as we could get to, the priest's house, which is another of our properties on the site, just next to the church. So the church burnt down in the Great Fire of Smallhythe in 1514-15, and we were hoping that this trench might return some evidence for that great fire, if it was indeed great. We have not found any evidence for the Great Fire of Smallhythe in any trench we have dug to date on the site. So this was probably one of our best shots, given how close it is to the chapel, and there was no evidence of a burnt deposit there. What there was evidence for, however, was quite a lot of Victorian ceramics, flower pots, plates, things like that. So we think we have come down onto the midden or gardening deposits for the priest's house, which was where Edie Craig lived with her 2 partners, Christopher St. John and Tony Atwood. And we have a nice sort of mixture of later material from there. Also recovered from here was a fairly substantial woodworking axe, but quite late, we think. So Damien Goodburn did have a quick look at this and thought 19th century. So unfortunately not directly associated with shipbuilding, but nonetheless a spectacular find. So trench 6 was in the southern part of the garden. So we were down here. So the house itself is here, and we put a trench in just down here to investigate these anomalies that had shown up on the geophysics, which turned out to be, we think, road drains. So this trench we had, again, post-medieval archaeology, Victorian, looks like partially land reclamation, possibly flooding deposits, but it is an area that we'd like to investigate a little bit further next year. And there you see a late Victorian view of the Smallhythe Place frontage. So in days gone by, what is now part of the garden was actually part of the roadway as well. So we had a sort of wider approach to the bridge, and previously there was also a ferry crossing there. Trench 7 was in the Forstall field, and again, we're really good at hitting midden deposits on this site. So as well as finding more of the chalk that Archaeology Southeast had found in 2006, so more of these sort of yard surfaces or access routes, this time we came down onto the midden for Smallhythe Place itself. So we think we have Ellen Terry's rubbish dump, gin bottles, champagne bottles, toothbrushes, toothpaste, marmalade, all sorts of really lovely things that it was such a nice thing to find, given our spirit of place at the property is so interconnected with Ellen Terry herself. And these would have been things that she would have handled, quite possibly. We've also been working, as I mentioned earlier, with a metal detectorist, James Ward. And some of them, the most spectacular finds have come from James, so including this from the garden, which is an early 19th century piece of jewellery, which we think might have been bought as costume for the theatre, because we also have a small theatre on site, the Barn Theatre. And also, some artefacts that do relate to that period in between the end of shipbuilding and the beginning of Ellen Terry's occupation, when the site was a farm. So we have a crotal bell here that was found in the Forstall field. So we're back to the Elfwick field at this point, looking for evidence of the medieval village of Smallhythe. In 2021, we had a small trench at the top of the Elfwick field, so to the northern part of the field, trench 2, and we came down onto essentially backyard surfaces with ceramics that was, giving us a good medieval, post-medieval date. So this year, we opened a larger trench, trench 11, and came down onto the fairly substantial and quite spectacular remains of a building, 2 buildings, in fact, we think here. So we have, this is temperamental, we have a very long chalk foundation at the top of the slide here, north is to the top. We do appear to have the return of the rear of the building, or part of the rear wall, at the far end of the slide there. This is a chalk-built foundation and quite deep as well, so the foundations go down around a metre or so. So potentially a cellared or part-cellared building, no direct dating evidence from the fabric, but potentially a missing medieval or early post-medieval building. This was a brilliant trench, I have to say. They really had some good stuff in here. So as well as this very large foundation, subsequent excavation in this area also revealed the remains of potentially a second structure coming out in this section here, a smaller building that may have been built once this larger structure had been demolished. So we have, as I mentioned, some really a really good artifact assemblage from this trench. Medieval, post-medieval, there is some Roman mixed in there as well, but we would expect to find that because we would expect the Roman settlement to carry on up the hill. But some lovely pieces, and including really unusual artifacts like this, which is a weight, a measure for the kind of thing you might have used in a shop. And it should be 8 ounces, that's what it's marked at, but it's actually underweight. So whoever was using it was scamming their customers a little bit. What we also have from across the site Not so many in 2021, but really a huge number discovered in 2022 were ship snails and roves. So here are some of the 2021 examples being x-rayed at Canterbury Christchurch for us. And also during the metal detecting survey in 2021, we found, James found a strip of roves. So these are indicative of roves that have, of course, not yet been used in a vessel. So good evidence for manufacture of these items and shipbuilding taking place nearby. So it is at this point, and mention of ships, that I'm delighted to hand over to Eliott, which will just involve doing that.
Thank you, Nat, and thank you everyone for inviting us. So, what on earth, really, why are we hoping to find something like that somewhere which is about 10 miles from the sea? Well, as Nat has alluded to, it is to do with the changes in the landscape. Is it? Okay. So, a series of storms in the 13th century, there are about 4 serious storms culminating in the Great Storm of 1287, which does change. Oh, I see, sorry. Changes the landscape considerably. The blue line here shows the original pre-1287 shoreline. So Old Winchelsea was here somewhere, has now been flooded. New Romney is now about a mile inland. And the Rother, which predominantly still runs west of the Isle of Oxney, instead of coming out at New Romney, comes out down by Rye. But the big change with regard to Smallhythe's development, both as a shipbuilding centre and as a thriving medieval port and harbour, comes in the early 1330s. And what happens is, west of the Isle of Oxney, just where the blue line comes up, they construct a thing called the Nell Dam, and they block the western course of the Rother, and they force it round the top end of the Isle of Oxney. So suddenly the main course is running right past our site at Smallhythe. So they were probably building small barges, fishing boats, something like that beforehand. Suddenly now it is the main channel. There's 2 reasons why they may have done this. Possibly, as Nat alluded to earlier, they possibly want to reclaim the land west and south of the Isle of Oxney, but also during this period, throughout most of the medieval period, the channel in particular is a very unsafe place. You have got pirates all over the place. Well, virtually everyone is a pirate one day, a fisherman the next day, and law-abiding the next, and what have you. And throughout the various wars with France, Winchelsea and Rye, Romney, all these places are attacked and they are sacked repeatedly, particularly through the 100 Years' War, which is about to kick off in about 1353, 54, 55, 50, around 1350s anyway. So if you're building ships down here, the French know where they are. Ships, medieval ships, require a huge amount of investment in money, in time, in valuable timber. These are very vulnerable sites, and the French know all about these coastal settlements. They've probably never heard of this tiny place called Smallhythe, which is hidden way up behind the Isle of Oxney. So I think there's a strategic imperative about this change, as well as just land reclamation. In some respects, I think Smallhythe becomes sort of like medieval England's secret weapon, as a sort of secret shipbuilding site. And from the sort of mid-14th century, we start getting named ships being constructed at Smallhythe. Barges and ballingers are very similar. They're oared vessels. Medieval ship terminology is very opaque, but broadly speaking, barges, balingers, row barges, galleys. They're all probably something along the lines of a sort of more modified Viking longship type thing. It's an oared, shallow drafted, fast manoeuvrable vessel. And then you've got larger ships and galleasses, which we'll come to later, which are purely, the ships are purely sail-driven. This is an example of a Ballinger. Well, it's a conjectured version of a Ballinger done by Ian Friel, the great expert on medieval shipping. And the George, built at Smallhythe in 1416, is just such a Ballinger, except this is the first known named ship in Britain to have two masts, which is quite a revolutionary thing. It's not just in terms of propulsion, but in manoeuvrability, and it allows you to steer closer to the wind. So this is quite a revolutionary thing to have two masts. The Jesus, the second largest of Henry V's great ships, 1,000 tons, she was built at Smallhythe at the same time. Or when we say Smallhythe, I think increasingly we're looking at a stretch of land from Smallhythe downstream to Reading Street, and that I think will become apparent as we go further forward. So that's a Ballinger, something similar to the George with one less mast. This is something similar to the Jesus. This is a reconstruction or a CGI version of Henry V's biggest ship, the Grasdieu, which was built in 1418 in Southampton. Bigger than the Jesus, about 400 tons bigger, but probably not that much bigger in size. And this is about the same size as HMS Victory. So we're looking at big ships being built at Smallhythe. Not this one, but something just a little bit smaller than that. And again, the Jesus had two masts. Grasdieu had three. And shipbuilding continues at Smallhythe, and we get into this change in technology from medieval shipbuilding, where we have clinker vessels on the left, overlapping planks. The planking is the main strength of the vessel, with the frames added in for stiffening. And one of the ways you can tell a clinker vessel is by looking at the frames or futtocks, and you can see they have these little indentations in where it says Q there. These little indentations which are for the overlapping flanks to fit into the frames. And if you look closely at the frame or futtock that the time team excavated, you will see that indeed has joggles, and thus rejoices in the name of joggled futtock, which you can't say often enough. And as you get into the late 15th century, early 16th century, in Britain and Northern Europe, this medieval style is replaced by carvel build, where you have planking on edge, end to end, and the frame is the main strength element. The frame is built first, and the planking is attached to it. So when we talk about roves and clench nails, they are all about the medieval clinker vessels. That's how they're held together. You bash a nail in, you put the rove over, you bend over the nail, you snap the end off. When you're into carvel building, these are predominantly held together by wooden dowels or tree nails or trenels. So totally different style of building. The next big ship known to be built at Smallhythe is the Regent. And again, it suggests that this is built a little downstream at Reading Street. This is Henry VII's flagship. And we don't know for sure whether she's carvel or clinker. It's right on the cusp of this change. She was sunk in battle with a French ship in 1512, the Cordelière. They both caught fire and sank. And apparently there was a French team who were trying to locate the Cordelière. This was a battle off Brest Harbour. So hopefully at some point they might find something, and we could work out, if they could possibly work out the difference between two ships of virtually the same date, which burned together and sank together, work out which one's which. It'd be interesting to see whether Regent is a medieval ship, if you like, or an early post-medieval one. So the Regent sinks in 1512. Henry VIII needs a new flagship, and he builds the Henri Grasdieu, this colossal ship, in Woolwich in 1514. However, he gets the timber from Smallhythe. he gets the master shipwright from Smallhythe, and he gets a load of shipbuilders and the workforce from Smallhythe who walk from Smallhythe to Woolwich to work on the ship. And so the only thing I think what this proves is that they probably wanted to make it in Smallhythe, but the water wasn't deep enough. And throughout this period, we're starting to get references of the channel starting to silt up. In the past, I've argued that building a ship in London proves the superiority of London shipbuilding. I'm now beginning to revise my opinion, having worked at Smallhythe, but such is archaeology. The ornery grassager is, however, an environmental, an evolutionary dead end in shipbuilding. It's the last of, or one of the last of the great medieval fighting castles at sea, if you like. And two of the last vessels constructed at Smallhythe are very different. This is the Grand Mistress. It's a galleass. So what this is a sailing ship, much lower, and it has oar ports. And the idea is it can engage French galleys, the sort of things which caused the sinking of the Mary Rose. The carracks couldn't fire forward. They had a blind spot. So these galleasses can fire forward. They have a cannon forward. So it's a hybrid ship-stroke-galley form. And these proved to be very successful in the war, the Grand Mistress and the Anne Gallant. And these proved to be the direct lineal ancestor of the race-built galleons such as the Ark Royal or the Revenge that fought in the Armada, and thus into the ship of the line. So this was the way forward. The two of the very last ships that Smallhythe created really showed the way forward. And we don't really get a lot after this. The two later references, there's a lot of uncertainty about these. It's been argued that these are just other names for the Grand Mistress and the Anne Gallant. We're not sure as yet. But the thing is silting up. The river is silting up. In 1600, the Nell Dam actually collapses. They rebuild it. Between, I think, 1611 and 1625, they spend something like £11,000, the locals, trying to keep this channel open. They are dredging it. They are just scarifying it, raking it. At one point, they build a huge 200-acre artificial lake. It's called an indraft. The idea being you fill it up with water, and then every now and then you open the sluice gates, and it flushes huge amounts of water and cleans the channel. That doesn't work. They are literally throwing money into the river. And in the end, in 1635, they have enough. They breach the Nell Dam. The river goes back to its old course. And it's all over. It's all over. Shipbuilding has gone. So looking for shipbuilding, medieval shipbuilding, what we'll be looking for? Well, it isn't going to be something like this. This is Portsmouth Royal Dockyard in the 18th century. Great big dry docks, launching slips. It seems in the medieval period, there are two ways to launch a slip. If it's something small like a galley or a small ballinger, you can build them close to the river's edge and you could drag them into the water, potentially digging a small launch channel to put it into. And so the archaeological evidence for that might be some post holes, might be a bit of hard standing, evidence for scaffolding, things like this. For the big ships, you can't really drag a 1,000-ton ship into the water. They would have built a big hole behind a riverbank, effectively a dock, left the riverbank intact, built the ship, bashed down the dam, if you like, and then let the ship float off at high tide. So those are the two things we'd be looking for. Great big holes for big ships, or a bit more ephemeral stuff for launchways for smaller ships. Right. So this, again, these smaller vessels, such as the barges, the ballingers, things up to 120 tons, probably or may well have been launched on these sort of launch channels or winched in off the surface, whereas anything bigger, sort of the Grand Mistress, Jesus, etc., must have been built in a dock. So looking at what Time Team did, they thought they'd found possible slipway evidence, and it's kind of very topographic. So we went to have a look again at what they did. You can see that the kiln here was in Trench 5. At the time, they weren't 100% sure that it was a kiln, so we thought we'd have another look there. And as Nat said, this is it showing up just here. And so we put a trench in there, just to the left, and we showed up this, so you can see it is indeed a kiln. That's the southern kiln wall, the red there, and the northern kiln wall. And it's quite substantial in size, 2.5 meters long. And what's interesting is we dug a hole in here, and we found not one, but 2 earlier kiln floor surfaces. So it's been in use for a considerable amount of time. It's been repaired at least twice. What's it doing there? Presumably, there's no evidence of it doing ironworking. We found vitrified bricks in there, so it looks like it's a brick kiln, presumably making bricks for ships' galleys for cooking area on a ship. The other thing, as Nat said, we did a lot of boreholes. Robert Jane Siddell helped us with a lot of boreholes, and we found that the shoreline was different on both sides of the road. On this side, we had sandy beach deposits here. This was a conjectured line that we drew, the blue line. So we've got natural weald and clay above the blue line here. Here in the Elthwick field, we have sand, beach sands. Over here, we found something very different. We had the same natural clay north of the blue line, and south we found alluvial deposits, which suggested possibly a man-made wharf or some kind of structure. We weren't coming down onto anything like a beach there. So this year we decided to look further into what we had. We put in another trench just southwest of where we had the kiln, this area here, and this showed up beach sands to the south. They look very dirty there, coming on to the natural weald and clay here, and then to the north, the kiln, by the way, is about here somewhere. We found evidence of gravel, which has to be brought in. There's no natural gravel around there, laid as a surface, some kind of hard standing. And we went and dug further down, put a slot through it, and we found evidence of at least one earlier gravel surface as well. So they are creating right here, this is the top of the foreshore, where is it? There. Right here, they're building a hard standing, which is at least 2 iterations of it, next to a kiln, which has had at least 3 iterations of it. So they're doing something here over time, right on the river's edge. James, our metal detectorist, casually sort of waved his metal detector over this spore heap here and came back to the next morning with a great big handful of roves, like that, out of a pile like this. I went, oh, okay, this is quite interesting, because up to this point we'd had bits of rove and nails scattered all over the site. This was a big lump of it right here. So we said, well, James, why don't you go and have a bit more of a look down that area and run your metal detector in a few lines across there. This is the trench. That's the kiln trench. And we've got an astonishing amount of targets suddenly cropping up, like loads of them. You can't move for them. And what we're getting is a whole series of washers, roves, nails, all along this top of the foreshore here. So here's an example of a used clench nail. You can see it's been driven in, the rove has gone, it's been bent back on itself, but it gives us an idea of the size of the plank that would be used there. Here are a couple. Here's one unused rove next to a strip of 2 smaller unused roves rather. Here is a nail with a rove in it. And you can see here, this would be where the 2 planks overlapped. So we're looking at a couple of planks slightly less than an inch thick, so it gives us an idea of the size of vessel that could come up. And there were so many roves, we ended up just recording them briefly, and we're photographing them, and we put them back in the ground because we were now getting lots and lots and lots of medieval ironworking. So in terms of ephemeral evidence for medieval shipbuilding, we've got a hard standing right on top of the waterline. We've got roves used and unused, so they're probably breaking ships as well, potentially there. And we've got lots of nails. We've got a brick kiln. There's a lot of elements there. That's all I can say at the moment. I'd like to say more. Next year, we shall open more at that area. The other thing was the other side. If you see here the blue line, we suggested there might be a medieval wharf structure there. And so we opened a trench to find it, and to my excitement, we did indeed find evidence of a medieval wharf. Nathalie made me put that picture in there. It could have been worse. And what we've got here, I don't know if you can see, this is the natural Wealden clay here, and this is a very distinct edge where the ranging rod is dropping down, and in this section, can't make this work. Right, you've got that's the Wealden clay going down. This is your alluvial stuff here, and it sort of swings out a little bit, but there's a stake hole in there. What it looks like is we've got a wattle revetment. So some kind of man-made wharf front. But what is interesting or confusing is how shallow it is. It's really shallow. It's about 2.5, 3 feet. So you could use that if you've got like small barges, rowing boats, things like that. You're not, I suspect, going to be able to launch a very large ship into 2.5, 3 foot of water. But I think potentially, if you're coming further out into the deep channel, it is going to get deeper. It is potentially possible, I think, for those smaller, those barges, ballingers, potentially to be built up here with a launch channel that we haven't found yet. I think it is almost certain that the big ships, your Jesuses, your Regents, I think they have to be built a bit further downstream towards Reading Street. And the evidence, documentary evidence kind of hedges that way. So I think what we're looking at is actually a shipbuilding landscape stretching from Smallhythe to Reading Street. Different plots being used potentially at different times. This area here is at the very least, I would suggest, supplying shipbuilding downstream. And I think hopefully we can find enough evidence for them actually building something relatively small in that area next year. Part 3. And I think that is where I hand back.
Excellent. Okay, so for the last few minutes, we're just going to very, very quickly look at the Roman activity on this site. I should add that 2021 was really interesting season for us because obviously we were out there all fired up to look for evidence of medieval shipbuilding. First day, first trench, first shovelful practically, what comes out but a really lovely unabraded piece of Samian ware, and that kind of set the scene for that first season of excavation. I think it's safe to say we were possibly taken a little by surprise at the volume of Roman material that was coming out. Almost every trench we put in returned some kind of Roman ceramic or building material, so we're going to have a very quick look at that and how happy it made everyone, Eliott included, obviously. So we do have Roman activity across the Elfwick field, 1st century and 2nd, 3rd century. So the pot assessment from the 2021 excavations certainly suggests we may have two fairly distinct phases of activity. We have a series of cut features from trenches 1, 3 and 10, which are in the sort of central part of the field, or the sort of edge of the geophysics. What we thought might turn out to be evidence for sort of medieval village activity has almost entirely been Roman towards the central part of the Elfwick field. Just a quick run around these images. Top left corner, we've got Dr. Jane Siddell excavating some of the boundary ditch features in Trench 1. This was an area where we thought we might have possible human cremations. Actually turned out to be cows, which then turned into a bit of a theme. We'll come on to cows. Trench 10, this year's excavations under the Saharan sun. This was a particularly punishing trench to work in, with no shade and Wealden clay baked like concrete. We had an amazing field team this year. A series of dump layers, ditches, pit deposits, so Roman settlement activity. Trench 3, just to the north of that last year, evidence for a small robbed out building. Bottom left corner with the strange lady in the stripy dress and the confused looking children is a beam slot and possible floor surface for another Roman structure. And the bottom right corner, it shows Harry Farmer, our National Trust archaeology apprentice, recording some of the ditch sections and pits in Trench 10. Huge amounts, again, this year of Roman ceramics from this site. So last year, here's a quick snapshot of the fines processing area. 31 kilograms of Roman pottery from Trenches 3 and 1 last year, much to the despair of our fines supervisor, Matt Champion, medieval specialist. A real mixture of material, locally made wares, and quite a lot of imported material as well. So we have some really nice Roman ceramics with some nice flagons. We have Samian ware. This year we found one with a potter's mark, so this first century potter. I've been reliably informed. Some really nice decorated Samian as well across the 2 years of excavation. And particularly from Trench 1 this year, some really lovely vessels that were able to be partially reconstructed by our volunteers on site, which is really brilliant to be able to give people that opportunity. So 2 partial pot reconstructions, one of black burnished ware, the second one is of redder fabric, seen here in excavation by Jane, and then here in the reconstructed version, and we have a 3D model of these ceramics, so you can actually explore them online. As I mentioned earlier, cattle were probably the predominant type of animal that we recorded this year. We had a lot more bone this year than last year. Bone doesn't survive particularly well on this site, and a lot of it is very fragmentary, but we did get a noticeable amount of jaw bones this year, and also a cow skull seen here being excavated by Izzy and Hannah from Cardiff University. And last year we also had 9, I think it was the final count, stamped Roman tiles, stamped with Classis Britannica stamp. These have been assessed for us by Kevin and Lynn Cornwall of the Hastings Area Archaeological Research Group. So interesting to think about what type of settlement this is. We also had a lot of slag, so potential domestic activity, potential industrial activity, possibly ironworking nearby. We haven't yet excavated a kiln, but there is an awful lot of ceramics on site and a huge amount of ceramic building material, including these tiles associated with the Roman naval fleet, which hopefully made Eliott a little bit happy because it is ship-related. This area, really there were no dots on the map for Roman archaeology, with the exception of those we mentioned earlier, Archaeology Southeast work in 2006 and the surface finds made by Haag in 2019. Ivor Margery does propose that there is a branch line leading down from the main east-west Roman routeway from Tenterton down, heading towards us at Smallhythe. So would be around here. And obviously that dynamic sort of landscape comes into play again. Without all of that land reclamation, you know, shallow sea or emerging land is a wonderful way of putting it. You know, you're practically on the coast, essentially, or potentially on the coast during parts of the Roman period. We also there are Roman artifacts surviving from the Isle of Oxney just here. The place name is very suggestive given all of the cattle that we found, and also this altar stone that survives in one of the churches. It's quite commonly referred to as a Mithraic altar, but could be, I guess, an altar to Apis as well, a bull god. We do have sort of, you know, other examples of Roman activity in the vicinity. So this is a National Trust find, or a National Trust collection item. This is a cinerary urn from Bodiam Castle. It was apparently one of a number that was discovered in 1902. This is the only one that survives. And there are other antiquarian references to Roman cremation urns from places like Reading Street, sort of further downstream. Moving up into the Weald as well, we have examples like this from Bardown in Wadhurst. Again, another example of a sort of small-scale industrial site with a domestic aspect with imported material coming in. And again, those links to the Classis Britannica, which have been noted at a number of sites across the area, including Bodiam and Bardown. So just to finish up, what next? We are planning for season 3 at Smallhythe, because we feel there is quite a lot more to learn about the medieval shipbuilding, but also about the Roman archaeology. I never thought those words would have come out of my mouth 10 years ago, I have to say. We'd like really to sort of enhance the engagement work that we did, do a lot more work with children and young people next year, and a lot more direct engagement on site. So fingers crossed that we get out again in August next year. And in the meantime, we'll leave you with some Sketchfab 3D models that you can explore online of the house itself and some of the features in the garden. And just finish up with saying thank you so much for having us here this evening, and hopefully we get to come back again one day and tell you all about it one more time. Oh, thank you.